Not too long ago, somebody left a comment on my video on Trump, and the comment itself did not serve as the full inspiration to make this video, but it's been something I've been thinking about for a long time. And the guy asked if I was still friends with Barbarossa because of my views on Trump. Now, the first thing that struck me about this comment was, well, what are my views on Trump? I've repeatedly pointed out that I have a fairly neutral position on Trump. I don't extol him as a god, and I don't think he's the devil either. He's just a guy, and we'll see what happens. That's kind of my position on Trump. Was he a better pick than Hillary? I think almost certainly, in my view. That doesn't mean I'm a fan or a worshiper or some sort of acolyte of Trump. Regardless, let's assume that I had an extremely positive view of Donald Trump. And Barbarossa, whose views on Donald Trump, frankly speaking, I don't know, but based on this comment that was left, had a very negative view on Donald Trump. And it begs the question then, in that context, this I'm going to argue here fictional context, because I neither know Barbarossa's views on Trump nor are my views on Trump particularly strong one way or another. But it begs the question that why would I not be friends with Barbarossa if, in this fictional setting described by the commenter, we had very, very different views? Now, of course, this speaks to this strange and perhaps not so strange phenomenon that we see on a daily basis, above all on the internet, but also in daily life if you happen to live in North America in particular. And that is the politicizing and consequently identifying of just about everybody in some really neat category, above all political category. And then, as a consequence of that, battle lines, if you will, are drawn, which is to say, the person is identified as political X and therefore can no longer interact with political Y. Now, I don't get a lot of this in my daily life because I'm a weirdo, I don't interact with a lot of people, I live in Germany, yada, yada, yada. But it seems to me that in the United States, my former country, this is rampant, this is omnipresent, that it isn't just an internet thing, and I want to talk about that in a bit, but a real life phenomenon where you believe X, Y, Z, and then, oh, you're that, we can't be friends, we can't associate with you. And it goes a lot deeper than just not associate. I mean, you hear these stories. I know a guy on the West Coast who's a serial dater, and he'll be really, really careful about what he has to say because I don't think he really leans right. He's a bit like me. He's sort of just a bit nebulous on. He takes each issue on its own, but he's not a left winger. Just like I'm not a left winger, nor am I a right winger. But still, he's got to be really careful when he's engaging in serial dating, what he says, or at work, or the people he talks to, or even with his family. I don't really talk politics with my family. There's no point. Needless to say that both my parents lean much further left than I do. But the point I'm trying to make here is that people these days, I believe more than ever, and in large part due to the internet, or perhaps solely due to the internet, are defined by their politics. And whatever my view of Trump might be in this fictional setting I described, why would that affect my friendship with Barbarossa? I don't talk to Barbarossa that often these days because he's a busy man and he lives on a different continent, but I'm still friends with him. And, well, take Coltrane, for example. Man, there are tons of issues. I don't agree with Coltrane, I mean, he's much more left-leaning than I am. I wouldn't say I dislike his hedonism, but it does kind of, I don't know, it sort of gets at me when I'm thinking of grandiose plans on how to advance humanity, and he just wants to get drunk and eat roast chicken and potatoes. But he's a good friend of mine. I'm not going to, oh, he believes this, his philosophical worldview is opposed to mine. Oh, woe is me. We're not going to be friends. He's also a filthy casual when it comes to gaming. Another despicable trait. I'm only half joking, or am I? But regardless, at least on that point, who cares? I think there's an entirely different world out there where people of differing views and differing perspectives can still get along and get along well without tearing each other's eyes out, hair out, whatever, and also, in general, not disavowing each other just because one person believes X and the other person believes Y, political or otherwise. I think it's really immature. Now, the internet, of course, has been the largest contributor to this. Things like Twitter and Reddit and all of the YouTube. In YouTube, everything is drawn along these political lines. Not just purely politics. I mean, think about MGTOW. MGTOW, I don't even know what that means anymore. And I can use the label to describe myself, or I cannot. It doesn't really matter to me either way. I've talked about this in previous videos. But at the end of the day, you get lumped into that category, and, that's filled with all kinds of properties, if you will, and qualities. Everyone fits into a category. And sometimes these categories are true. Now, this brings us to the point of identity. Identity politics. This is kind of what it's about. And identity in general is a tricky issue. It's often claimed, often by the alt-right, that people have no identity, that particularly Western individuals are just sort of atomized, floating about. I don't think that's really true. If you actually examine the evidence, what's happened is that identity has gotten a lot more complicated. Now, it would be one thing to argue identity is too complicated, and I'm not just talking about political identity necessarily, but identity is too complicated. We need to go back to a simple, rustic identity, and a lot of people, say on the alt-right, would argue for that. But the reality is that identity is just complicated, multifarious, and doesn't allow itself, that is to say, identity, to be pigeonholed as just one thing, oftentimes. Now, on a macro scale, obviously people are going to pigeonhole you. I play online games on occasion. Since I grew up in the United States, when I speak English, if I'm not faking something, which I can do a pretty good job of, I speak with an American accent, so people will ask you, where are you from? Where are you from? What are you doing here? What are you doing on a European server? And reluctantly, I might give some brief explanation as to why I have an American accent, etc. Now, they will jump on that sometimes and make all kinds of stupid jokes about McDonald's or whatever. The point is that, my English phonology, when I'm not faking it, gives away a certain part of my identity, which is to say, some variety of American English is part of my identity. However, I do not conform to what many might consider the stereotypical American, quite the opposite. And usually that's quickly revealed by me speaking other languages to people in their languages. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, you can, in a simplified sense, talk about identity, whether it's political identity, nationality, ethnic, whatever, as a very sort of straightforward thing. Or you can look at it in its actual composition, and I think it's a lot more complicated. And I'm not saying that there is no such thing as identity. It doesn't exist. I'm also not really saying that identity is fluid, although there is a greater degree of fluidity to identity. After all, the atoms that comprise our bodies are not the same as they were 10 years ago, and things change. Our brains develop past a certain age. I mean, an example, even a rustic Bavarian farmer, say he's 45, he doesn't even speak German, he only speaks Bavarian. For a living, he slaughters hogs, and that's how he grew up. Even he is different at age 45 from his former self at age 23, and 13, and likewise. So there is a degree of fluidity to identity. It's just that we want to simplify things. We want to categorize things. We look for patterns. Now, some people, I'd argue some people do have a simpler sense of identity. That Bavarian farmer I described, he has a simpler sense of identity than I would. Just because he grew up in Bavaria, that's what he's been a farmer all his whole life, his father was a farmer, etc. But I'm not going to necessarily accede to the claim that my identity or identity of people I know is the consequence of an atomizing process. It's branched out, yeah. So yeah, born in the United States, spent my childhood there, spent almost all of my adult life, barring South Korea, in Europe. European father, American mother. So, there's just a lot of stuff going on there, and it's just not that simple, even linguistically. I say I'm not German. Now, I don't feel German, and I don't have a German passport, but linguistically, I'm more German than I am Finnish, or even French, because my German's better than my French, or whatever. And sadly, my German's vastly better than my Hungarian, so in some sense, I'm more German than I am Hungarian. There's just the problem, I think, and this isn't, I'm not criticizing the alt-right here per se, the left does it too, is trying to pigeonhole somebody, or people in general, as one thing. Now, there's another issue involving this, and that is people don't listen. This is nothing new, but if you were to ask people's views on me or what they think about my politics, well, first off, I'd argue most of them would get almost everything wrong. I've been called a Marxist. I've been called a fascist. I've been called far right, far left, libertarian. I've been called pretty much everything on the spectrum. A nationalist. There's some guy left a comment a while back insisting that I've gone full-blown nationalist. Now, everyone who's listened to me for years knows my views on nationalism. I don't think very much of it, and I'm not a nationalist, but hey. So there's that issue too. But I think the non-listening issue when it comes to identifying people and things is related to this innate psychological need people have to just lump people into some category that makes sense to them, because we got to do it somehow, right? And just leave it at that. People, as I've said many times, aren't concerned with truth and accuracy. They're concerned with whatever fits into their worldview and accommodates their worldview so they can feel good about themselves. Things are more complicated oftentimes than it is claimed. And the claim of, say, identity atomization is a bold one. And, because identity is no longer singular or having only two or three parts to it. When you've lived all over the world and lived in many different countries like I have, and you speak different languages, for just as an example, because of convenient reference, you're going to have a more complicated identity than, a Bavarian hog farmer or a farmer in Nebraska who harvests wheat. It's just the way it is. But many people would argue that only those individuals, the Bavarian hog farmer and the Nebraskan wheat farmer, have an actual identity. It's just not as clear-cut as people would like to make it out to be. I have a Dutch friend. I've actually interviewed him. He has a German background, and, he feels that's part of his identity. I never really think of him as German, but he feels it's part of his identity, and part of that's due to experiences he had in high school and prejudice against Germans in the Netherlands. So, okay, that's part of his identity then. Things are just not as clear cut. Now, the pigeonholing is useful for some people, but what I want to try to point out in this video, above all, is that few of us who actually think and are pensive believe that the basis of human friendships and relationships should be entirely wrapped up in whatever political view you have, philosophical view, etc. My best friend is a hardcore libertarian. And I think sometimes he's just overzealous and idealist, and he's significantly younger than I am. So, yeah, I mean, that's my view. But it doesn't interfere with him being my best friend or maintaining a friendship. And I think that we who actually value human friendship and human alliances and human interaction are not going to be bothered by what I regard ultimately as petty differences. Now, of course, political differences can be vast. I mean, in some sense, one's political view is an extension of how one believes the world ought to be. But, so what? You know, I would like the world to be a certain way, and I think a lot of people would find that worldview problematic. You know, transhumanism, transcending human nature. But I'm unlikely to get my wish, at least anytime soon, or at least in my lifetime. I'll be dead before that. And so, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. The other thing about identity, political or otherwise, is that it's contextual. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So if I'm in an Overwatch game, and people aren't trolling, and we want to win, then the single most important quality and quantity of my identity is my contribution to the team, what I'm doing. Usually I end up playing Ana, player way too much, sick of her, but doesn't matter. So they only care about what I'm doing in this context. Am I healing? Am I being a utility to the team? Am I doing my job? In that context, for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or however long the match lasts, I'm a support hero, and that is the entirety of my identity. And then if I were to move into a political forum, express my views, people would try to pigeonhole me there too. I open up my mouth. My phonology is American, so that there'll be that description as well. It's all contextual. And now I'm not saying that everyone is anything and anything like some of these SJWs. I'm clearly not Korean or African. And I'm not 196 centimeters tall. In fact, that could never be a possibility. Why? Because the DNA, the data that my DNA was sending out, frankly speaking, was not encoded for being 196 centimeters. Instead, I'm stuck at 174. No one in my family, mother or father's side, is 196 centimeters. It's not in the cards. So, I mean, there are things that we are simply not, but it is a bit more complicated than either or. And I think I've addressed this in the either or video I made a while back. You're either this or you're that. And it is just more complicated and nuanced. Now, I realize in the political sphere, the political platform, that people have neither time and above all nor use for subtlety or nuance, which is to say, yeah, people are going to not care about the complexities and multifarious nature of identity. They're just going to label you as whatever. But that, of course, is an extension of people wanting to accommodate their own worldview, I think, as well as an extension of people's desire for expediency in a political sense. But it is more complicated. It's not life-defining. I mean, some people would argue identity is life-defining. That really depends on the context. But when I say it's not life-defining, whatever multiple identities I have, some of them are very important to me, such as, I don't want to get married. I don't want to get involved in the rat race. I mean, that's part of my identity. But other things, such as my view on humanity, which is admittedly a dismal one, and what we could possibly do to improve and progress. Yeah, that's important to me, but I'm not gonna, not have a friendship with, say, Coltrane because he's a hedonist who likes to eat and shit and doesn't agree with my worldview there. Which incidentally is a voluntary one. I don't think everyone, choose to be these things, but this is the issue of our time, I think, above all. Everything is being fractured and splintered along these lines. So getting back to that original example, I don't know what Barbarossa's views on Trump are, and mine aren't particularly strong. But even if they were, and they were in opposition, it's just human maturity, I think, not to allow human relationships to disintegrate along such petty lines. But this is what we see around society. And particularly on the internet, everyone is holed up in their little corner, doing their own thing. And by that I mean they have their little clique or group. And this is something I don't want to do. It's why I've talked to people from the alt-right. I've talked to MGTOW people. I've talked to professors on occasion. Talked to people, normies. I certainly don't want to be holed up in one group simply because it's my so-called comfort zone, or it's the position from which I can wage war against all the other groups. People should do their own thing, but sometimes you need to understand and accept that things are just more complicated and not as simple as we presuppose them to be. And that applies to identity. And it's another reason why lumping people into political categories as a sort of be-all and end-all, primary absolute, fails, because people are obviously, usually at least, a lot more than their political categories. And as for me, if people want to know what my politics are, they can ask me, because I'm neither right nor left, and I'm also not center. I'm just me with my own views on things. Now, some of those views might correspond to the right, and even a few of them might correspond to the left. And maybe some of them would be, centrist. But, yeah, the point I've been trying to make here is that some of us cling to the notion that mature adults don't need to define themselves along such petty lines. And things are more complicated than they seem to be. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll check you out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.